we have a few questions kind of targeted at each of the panelists rather than everybody answering all of the questions. But I want to start with Jim. Jim Yang is the Yan class of 97. And recently purchased a Cold Stone franchise to run right over here at Town and Country. And when I last spoke with you, we were contemplating buying another one as well.
Actually, I'm opening up 2 more.
2 more?
Yeah. Building them out right now.
Okay, so that doesn't go well with my South Beach diet, but we won't go there. As a relatively new franchise owner, can you talk about the process that you went through in identifying and selecting a franchise?
Yeah, and so, I think there are different tacks I can take with this one. I think, probably most relevant for this audience is probably to sort of discuss some of the philosophical, underpinnings of what happened here. So like a lot of you who are in school today, I was really fired up about, leaving the business school here and going off and doing some really exciting things. A lot of you are going to go into the high-tech industry, which is what I ultimately ended up doing. But what I found after I graduated in 97, I went to Netscape. And from day one of the things that sort of, began plaguing me was this notion that I was increasingly stuck in this rat race. And the whole proverbial working for the man, and getting stuck in a situation where there's no clear exit unless you're fortunate enough to pick the right startup company that hits that IPO pop, right? And so I dealt with this malaise for a couple of years, and started thinking about different ways to get out of this. And so ultimately, after sort of kicking around a bunch of different ideas for the last several years, I had a minor epiphany last summer, which was one way to sort of get out of this rat race and try to attain some semblance of financial independence. And by that I really mean not so much material wealth for its own sake, but really having the flexibility to do whatever I want to do and not have to worry about sort of my financial obligations. I started thinking about one way for me to get there was to really sort of recast the way I manage my asset portfolio. So to date, I had been plowing all my resources into what were really cash flow absorbing assets. So things like a house and car, and these are all things that are great from an appreciation standpoint, but don't really throw off cash, and are obviously things that you can live off of. And so this minor epiphany I had was really about recasting my asset allocation towards more assets that tend to be cash flow generating. So things like commercial, residential real estate properties or small businesses. And I thought, well, that could be an interesting way to go. And the great thing about this financial system that we live in is if you get into a business that can demonstrate reasonably stable and predictable cash flows, the banks will line up to lend you more money, which you can then use to either expand your business or go out and buy other businesses or other properties. And the cycle just goes on. And that's how people like Donald Trump have been able to dig themselves out of these massive holes by basically using the financial system, the lending system, to really they lever themselves up and up to the point where they have more than enough money coming off of their operations to fund their lifestyle, along with the management and operations of their businesses. And so I originally thought about doing a restaurant, so something like an Applebee's, but more of like a standalone type of entity. And I spent some time in New York and Boston pre-business school, and so there were a number of concepts that I thought that would do really well here in Palo Alto. And the more I researched it, the more I realized the odds were against me because in the restaurant business, as some of you may know, it's very, very high risk. So 8 out of 10 fail within 18 months. The capital required to open one of these up, especially of the kind of scale that I was thinking, are pretty formidable. I mean, I was looking at 7 figures plus to open up something that for all I knew could even with the best intentions and with the best staff would fail. And then third, and perhaps most importantly, like many of you, I had no idea how to run a restaurant. And had no business trying to do it on my own. And so I realized, those 3 things coupled together, don't add up to success. So, for me, I decided to scale back my expectations and my thinking a little bit, and came to this notion of a franchise. And so, to be honest, I had always had sort of a I don't want to say negative, but not a positive, connotation with franchises, because it's something that, from my perspective, you don't necessarily, need to invest, $100,000 in your MBA education to go do it. And you could really just do it straight out of high school. And so, it wasn't something that I thought would be a great way to sort of build my career. But ultimately, I felt like a franchise was a good way to go because, they tend to be a lot lower risk than trying to do something on your own, right? Because the concepts are proven, right? I mean, there are people who have spent years tweaking the formula to get it to work, and the risk is a lot less about market risk and a lot more about execution risk, right? And that was something I felt like, I could handle, or people I could hire could handle. Secondly,
how did you end up picking Cold Stone?
So for that, I really wish I could say for this audience that it was a result of a comprehensive and exhaustive analysis, but it really wasn't. So, when I decided to do the franchise thing, there was really only one that I really thought of, and that was Cold Stone. And the reason was because I had been to, I think 3 Cold Stones I've been to, I think, 3 Cold Stones up to that point. And every single one I had been to had lines out the door, right? One was in Honolulu, one was in Palm Springs, another one was in LA. And it just sort of stuck in my mind, right, that was a concept I could do really well up here. And so it's really sort of like the Warren Buffett approach to investing. Right? He doesn't analyze the numbers to death. He doesn't, go out and subscribe to, hundreds of different research reports. Basically, if he likes the product, if he likes the management team, he's going to go out and buy the stock. And so, that's how I really settled on Cold Stone. And, with the benefit of hindsight, I probably would have done, more analysis of the local trade area, of the demographics of Palo Alto. Talk to more franchisees. There are a whole bunch of circumstances on why I didn't. But actually, and we can talk about sort of this later on when we talk about new or existing franchise. I actually was originally trying to open up a new franchise in the Bay Area. But as with a lot of franchisors, they will actually give you territorial rights. And so, as I was looking for new locations to put a store, there were existing franchisees who, even though they didn't have stores, had the territorial rights to the location. So I was really locked out and really persisted for about 6 months and was about to give up when they approached me and said, hey, we have a corporate-owned store in Palo Alto that we are now looking to transfer to a local owner-operator, and is it something that you're interested in? And at that point, the analogy I think of here is, you got a dog chasing a school bus, and what happens if the dog actually catches a school bus? Right? I don't think he knows. And all this time I've been trying to get a new franchise, and all of a sudden they said, hey, you could have this one if you want it. And I was really kind of stumped and had to think about it. And to be honest, I had to look for reasons not to do it. I dissected the numbers to death. I talked to various people that I trusted. And ultimately, to be honest, I was looking for a reason not to do it, and I couldn't come up with one. By then, I had been doing pretty senior stuff in the software industry, and I wanted to make sure that, if I did this, I could go back into software and without missing a beat. And the people that I worked with assured me that wouldn't be a problem. And so ultimately, I said, what the hell? I'll just go ahead and... I'm Mike, right? Yeah. So I said, what the heck? And, I went for it. And it actually... I'm almost embarrassed to say this, but it's probably, but totally serendipitously the best decision I've made, because not only has it sort of gotten me on this path towards what I view as entrepreneurialism, but it's really emboldened me to do a lot more things, and from that standpoint, it's great. But just as a side note, it's funny, like neither my wife nor my mom are very pleased about this whole ice cream thing, because they're embarrassed. I mean, when people ask my mom what I do for a living, she lies, right? It's true. She does not want to tell them that she raised her son to manage an ice cream store. So that's one of the challenges I run into in my own family.
Now, are you, because you mentioned a few of your goals in terms of some financial freedom, are you on track to achieve some of that in the time frame you were looking? Or?
Yeah. So I think I had 3 goals getting into this, and these tie into sort of my philosophy and my religion. But one certainly was financial. So I wanted to reach a point of self-sufficiency. And so, my goal was, Cold Stone at the time, at least here, was, as far as Northern California goes, which is Fresno to Oregon, probably like number 7 or number 8 in the state. And my goal was, definitively, with a bullet, get to number 1 and really be the top producing store in Northern California. And I wanted to really crank up sales. So because they had corporate management in place up to that point, I really felt like, with the kinds of learnings I've had in the real world, plus with my MBA training, I really should be able to ratchet it up. And from that standpoint, we've been very successful. So, I don't mind saying that within 6 months, we're now the top performing store in California. And, we're just driving it more and more. And I think a lot of the synergies that are now going to be created by opening up additional franchises in the area, I think are just going to increase performance even more. But to the other financial goal, I think 2 other kinds of goals I had were psychic goals. So, this is really about, being able to derive some level of gratification around what you're doing. Ice cream is fantastic, right? Because it's a very sort of fun, very social occasion. We get family coming in, we have friends coming in, we get people coming in on dates. And it's very much embedded and intertwined with the community, and has really provided a good platform for me to do a lot more of the outreach that I wanted to do. So, for example, I've been teaching part-time at Palo Alto High School, right? So one of my longer-term goals is to get back in teaching full-time, and it provides an opportunity to give me the flexibility to go into these environments and do what I want to do. And at the same time, it actually serves my store very well, because it just so happens that, from an employee base, I'm drawing from Pali High and Gunn High School, and so it actually works out pretty well.
I gather from your comments that you no longer have your day job.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting topic. So in the grand scheme of things, the beauty of getting into small businesses, and franchise is the way you go, that's great, is that it gives you a lot of self-sufficiency and independence to do whatever you want to do. And so I reached a point in November where got my store operating as well as it could, did all the sales and marketing things, all the operational things, and then got the ball rolling on my other two stores, hired the brokers and the architects, and I reached a point in late November where I was just flat out bored, right? And looking for things to do. And from a resource standpoint, there's only so much I can do in parallel. So I started, I put it out a couple inquiries, and then before you know it, I ended up in a job that I really love doing. But I just literally just started this week. But I was considering whether or not I should tell that to people, because I think there's something very romantic about being a small business owner and not having to worry about anything else. But the reality is what it's done is it's given me the opportunity to do a job that I'm really fired up about and excited about doing, and which is in contrast to previous jobs I've had post-business school, where I kind of felt like I had to do it because I have these mortgage payments and car payments, and just the whole all the risk and turmoil of leaving from one job to another. It just made life very unsatisfying.
Cool. Greg, you have how many Applebee's?
87.
87. Okay. Do you know where they all are?
I've been to all of them. Don't ask me to name them.
Look, can you talk about how you got to the point where you actually had 87 Applebee's? Did you grow into them, or how did you?
Both organic growth and acquisition.
Okay.
Yeah, I was a very different sort of background. I was really deliberate about it, and I had a commercial real estate business I started out of Stanford in '94. And that was doing fine toward the late 90s, and I was very interested in finding a hedge to it, something that was going to survive the coming recession, whenever it was. And so in '98, I started. And another thing happened in the '90s, which there developed a market of securitized franchise finance for sort of top-tier concepts. And top-tier means, more than 500 units. Successful. It's McDonald's, Wendy's, Applebee's, Chili's. There's only a dozen that qualify. But what you could do was borrow, almost all of the price of, acquiring or developing a top-tier franchise unit at, debt rates reflective of much less risky investments like real estate. And so in Washington State, where I had some office buildings, the Applebee's market came up for sale. It had 8 units. They were not performing well, and the existing franchisee, who was out of Chicago, wanted to sell because he couldn't make any money there. It's a very high-cost environment, very similar to California. But I looked at them and thought that we could do better. And I also thought when you look at the life cycle of franchise groups in Applebee's, and this is probably true in many concepts, you need to achieve critical mass in a market for sales to really start taking off. So I thought that based on sort of surveying, there are only 50 franchise groups out there, but based on surveying them, that this market was just about to turn the corner, when it got to 10 units, 12 units. And that proved to be true. So I bought the market, for $14 million in '98, and I borrowed 12.9 of it at 8%. And the interesting arbitrage opportunity was you buy franchise businesses like businesses, reflective of the very high level of risk, therein. So you buy on a multiple of EBITDA, in this case of 6, right? Whereas you borrowed, 90% at 8%. So you're getting an unleveraged yield of 16%, and you finance almost all of it at 8. It's almost an instant return of your equity. It's an anomaly that has corrected somewhat since, as most of the securitized lenders have in fact gone bust, as they deserve to do. But you can still, from legitimate banks in the franchise business, borrow 70% or 75% at now 5%, right, which is still a good spread for them. And you're still able to buy franchises at 5-6 times EBITDA. So it still exists. Someone's wrong, obviously. They're selling too cheap or they're lending too much. But I don't care, right? I mean, I care about the difference. So we bought those first 8. We grew volumes pretty significantly over the years and started building units. And then I started buying other markets in much the same way. So now we're in Ohio, Indiana, and New Jersey, and Delaware in addition.
Now, how involved are you with the management, or how is your management structured for that?
I'm the CEO, which is the second most important position in the company. The COO is the most important. And we're set up with market presidents running day-to-day operations in each market. They roll up to a chief operating officer who is really responsible for a whole variety of things. But one is sharing best practice as developed between all the different regions around the country and the other franchise, Applebee's markets out there. What I do is, strategy, finance, real estate, senior staffing, and franchisor relations, which are extremely important in this business.
Right. Now, given your real estate business, how much of your mind share does Applebee's consume relative to the rest of your?
About half.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, I'll ask you this specifically, given with all the rule playing. I mean, do you find that the reduced risk and responsibility of being a franchisee is worth the trade-off compared to being the franchisor? Or?
Yes. I sent her this question because
Yeah.
I think this is the key question. I've seen probably a dozen examples of people trying to start retail businesses, and they get all excited about how creative it is and all the challenges and this and that, and it is more risky and therefore more rewarding if you succeed, but your chances of success are so much smaller than joining a system like Applebee's where over 1,600 units, they have figured this thing out. And as Jim said, it's about execution. So our job is very simple.
Yeah.
We need to be perfect at execution. And that's a goal I can get my arms around. Mm-hmm. And we don't need to be creative. Someone else is creative, right? We don't need to worry about our competition even that much. We worry about them in a real estate sense, but not in the big picture of this and that. We trust our franchisor. They are in fact top quality. And if you're thinking about getting into this, go for the best franchise you can get your hands on and pay for it.
Now, how do you know which is the best franchise?
Well, you would judge a system's performance by the normal metrics. Mm-hmm. Growth, profitability, market share.
Yeah.
Applebee's is bigger than Chili's and Fridays combined, which are its 2 big competitors nationally.
Now, Jim, I'll ask all you guys this. I mean, Jim made the comment, and I think it's a common perception, that you don't need to invest $100,000 in your MBA to go be a franchisee. You can go do that right out of high school. I mean, what's kind of your reaction to that?
It's not true in many systems because for instance, Applebee's has 50 in the whole world,
Yeah.
right? So they won't let someone who's not already deep pocket experienced businessman into the system,
Yeah.
or person, sorry. In other systems like the Burger King, I was briefly a Burger King franchisee, and the contrast between the 2 systems is great. In Burger King, it's the old-fashioned sort of onesie Tuesday mom and pop sort of, this is your store and this is someone else's store, and it's rife with conflict. There's cannibalization issues all the time. There's inconsistent operations. There is constant mistrust between the franchisor and the franchisee. The alternative, which was really pioneered by Applebee's and now is probably the more common model, is a development territory, as you said. So, we have exclusive development rights and responsibilities in each of our markets, and we've agreed to build X units over X years, nationwide, and they'll hold us to it.
Yeah.
But we never worry about cannibalizing, anyone except ourselves, and we make that conscious decision frequently.
Right.
We never worry about the store next door being poorly operated because it's ours and we can take care of it. Yeah. Sometimes they are, but at least it's our fault, and it solves a whole host of problems.
Now, do you have somebody in each market that does site selection, or how do you guys do that?
Right now, Lauren Cortina, who's GSB
He's my class,
93, is doing most of our site selection.
Okay.
Yeah. And I see every site too, because that's really my.
That's right.
right.
Interesting. Well, John has been in the franchising business probably the longest of everybody up here, with varying kinds of experiences, and has been a franchisee for Sylvan Learning Center. Can you talk about what has kept you involved and re-involved in franchising? Obviously, it's been interesting enough to keep you hanging around for a while.
Well, or I didn't have a choice. I graduated in '84. I was working at Hewlett-Packard. And first year was exciting, and after that, the job wasn't passing the shower test. I was just not thinking about it when I got up in the shower. Did not, again, do as deep a search as I should. I saw an article in Entrepreneurial magazine, looked interesting, and I bought one Sylvan franchise in Stockton and 5 more in San Diego. For me, it was sort of an overnight success after about 13 years. Greg's point is very good. I thought I was buying it at the inflection point in terms of the penetration and the national presence of the brand, and I was about 5 to 10 years too early. So I sold my other 5 in San Diego, retained the one in Stockton, frankly, because nobody would take it off my hands, and returned back to the high-tech industry and have managed it part-time. And luckily, the past 5 or 6 years, it has become quite profitable, so provides me a nice cushion when I get my enforced sabbaticals from the high-tech industry from time to time. One of the issues I want people to think about is when you go into this, what is your exit strategy? If you're incredibly successful, you don't have to worry about it too much. If you own 100 franchises. If you only own a couple, it's a fairly illiquid business. It's pointed out that the ratios you can get, if you get a good cash flow going, that's great, but the multiple you can get is often not, it's not what you see in public markets, obviously. It's also not very liquid in terms of your time and your ability. Depending on the number you have, the skills required, you can get yourself trapped for a while in there, where you sort of, when they talk about profitless growth, you're making sort of enough money and you think it's worth enough that you don't want to walk away from it, but I'm trapped, it's not growing, what do I do? And I would also consider what industry you're in compared to where you might want to be if it does not succeed. So I returned to the high-tech industry and have been there for 12 years, but the first couple of years I had a bit of a tough time trying to sell, what had I learned in this period? Apart from obviously psychic benefits and financial rewards, what are you developing in your career? Part of it is an industry knowledge, part of it's contacts, part of it's managerial experience. Now, the managerial experience was incredible. The first week I made more decisions than I did at Hewlett-Packard. It was wonderful. I had the greatest time, but I was not really developing industry experience, and I was at a time in my early 30s where I would have been developing broad contacts in the high-tech business, which I wasn't really doing. So to some degree, when I went back to the high-tech industry, that 5 years was a bit of a hole in my career. So, you have to pick something obviously that matches your passions, but I would think a little bit about your exit strategy. If it doesn't work, how are you then going to play this into what has to come next if you have to go back to working for the man?
Can you talk about the implications of being in a service franchise as opposed to a product franchise?
Yes, well, of course, everybody thinks everybody else's job is harder, so I think mine is harder than theirs. But I believe it's somewhat more difficult duplicating. I had 6 franchises, a little bit more difficult. We don't really have a product. We have an educational system, but the growth of the center is largely developed and based on the director, the person that's working with the parents. They're like a principal of a private school. And to scale that out can be more challenging. You have to think ahead of time that we do. Back to your question about the difference of an MBA. We have a higher opportunity cost by going to a franchise. And so you generally do have to own multiple centers to make it worth your while, where somebody else might be happy owning one and making $60,000 a year. So you have to look at what are your skills to get the first one going, and then ultimately, are there skills you can buy in the marketplace? When the economics of the Sylvans back in the late 80s, I couldn't really pay the best educators to come and work for me, and so I struggled. Now, as we've done better, I can now pay people a very competitive salary to what they're getting as educators, and I can hire the best people. And so it's a standard chicken and egg. Would I invest enough in the people? That's hard. This is not a spreadsheet I'm running. This is cash out of my bank account. And it's tough to pay somebody 10 grand more a year when you don't know, they could leave next month or ruin your business for 6 months. So again, there's a lot of areas where it's much, you're dependent on smaller numbers of people, which can make it very good and very risky.
I'm kind of asking a question where I think I've heard a lot of the answers, but for each of you, has this felt like an entrepreneurial route, or does it feel like you're working for a larger company?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for myself, and it absolutely feels entrepreneurial along a few different dimensions. So, to make that transition from, working for the man to doing your own thing, it's a serious chasm you're crossing there. So, I tell you, the level of exhilaration and gratification you get from, calling the shots, right, and basically being accountable for, all of the both sort of crucial decisions as well as all the minutia. It's definitely a completely different mindset. From a skill standpoint, I view getting into the franchise world as an excellent first step towards building something grander, if that's what your goals are, because you learn how to do a lot of the blocking and tackling that you would learn anyway in sort of trying something a lot grander. But it's nice to sort of have kind of like a little laboratory, if you will, where you can experiment with different types of approaches. Everything from the basic things like what's the best way to organize your entity, what's the best way to what's the best way to go out and negotiate really good deals for your payroll services and a lot of your other administrative expenses, as well as like how do you deal with human resource management, right? So a lot of people told me coming into business school that HR was probably like the most important thing you can learn out of B school, and I can see how that's particularly relevant in the world that we live in. The people you hire are probably more mature and responsible, but I tell you, it's a different world altogether when you're hiring and staffing high school juniors who really only care about a couple of different things, and none of them are aligned with your business. It takes a while to get used to, frankly. I remember, I would pull my hair out. You have kids, so we look at historical sales data and staff accordingly based on weather patterns and historical sales. And so you're very precise in the number of people you staff, and you have a kid call in an hour before her shift saying, "Oh, I got concerts to a ticket tonight, so I'm not coming in," right? And you don't deal with that in the professional world, right? You assume people are going to be there.
Either that or they lie.
Yeah, exactly. But I think in terms of like helping you deal with those types of issues and learning and helping, for me, it's definitely helped me gain an appreciation that there are very different types of people in the workforce. I think here in Silicon Valley, you tend to expect a certain caliber of person, and I think that doesn't really reflect reality. And I think when you get into a world such as franchises, as well as other businesses that you're doing on your own, I think one of the realities is that you're really dealing with people at all different levels and all different levels of ambition. And so this has been really useful for me in helping me sort of from an emotional standpoint, handle it a lot better.
Now, Greg, what advice do you have for somebody who might aspire to own multiple locations of a franchise? What's kind of a good way to start in growing into that?
Buy them.
Do you recommend doing
perfectly seriously?
Do you recommend doing one to start with, or?
It's a more difficult way to do it, and I don't think the rewards are any greater. Mm-hmm. If you can pull it off, by scale and grow from there. There are great scale economies in this business. There's great financing available in this business. Let me comment on this point. I think any activity in which you have a 100% interest in the bottom line feels entrepreneurial.
Right.
And franchising is that. Right? Every decision I make touches that bottom line, and that's no different than if I had started a business where I had complete control over the creative too. Right? At the end of the day, you are dealing in an environment where you never have total control over your environment. And we have a set of constraints that are different than the constraints the franchisor feels, but everyone's got constraints. Ultimately, it's did I create the entity and do I live off its bottom line? And that is intensely satisfying when it works. It's intensely frustrating when it doesn't. Right?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, it's completely entrepreneurial, and you own it. You're making the payroll. You're doing all that. My mom was like yours. She loved that I was at HP. She didn't want me off like being a tutor. But I felt the other way around. I was so much more proud to say I had my own thing. So I mean, it depends in part on what your own direction is. And related to working for the man, or having watched some of the Iowa debates, I'll use that to get my own soundbite in. That I want to reemphasize some of the point Greg made in terms of the importance of the franchisor. And one of the ways you can evaluate that is many of the franchises, particularly those that have fewer of the master builders, is what is the Franchise Owners Association? That's going to tell you what the relationship is with the franchisor. Is it adversarial? Are they working together? Because there's an innate conflict there. They make their money off the top line. You make it off the bottom line. And unless I've looked, those lines are in different places. And so their motivation is to get you an increased sales regardless of whether it increases your profits. And so I think it's very important when you're evaluating, once you've found a concept, is to, again, find out what the relationship is with the franchisor. So not only meet the people, so you can judge them, because I believe, math term, it's necessary but not sufficient to have a great franchisor. If you don't have a great franchisor, it's going to be almost impossible for you to thrive. If you do have one, then it's up to you, and they give you that opportunity. But that's where I'd spend the time and find the reality. You can see, are there lawsuits? What's the turnover of franchises? There's a number of ways to evaluate the reality of the quality of the franchisor.
But just also to qualify, there are, as most of you probably know already, there are downsides to being a franchisee, right? So, I can't speak for the other ones, but there's certainly constraints that they impose on the business with respect to the brand and what kind of products you sell. The kinds of programs you can run, and of course, then there's this tax that they levy on you, right? So, which I used to wrestle with all the time, right? Because I end up paying this monstrous franchise royalty to the creamery, which for the first 3 months I would say is absolutely deserved because I could not have done any of that without them. But then beyond the first 3 months, the reality is I don't need them for a whole lot besides sort of overhead marketing support, and I feel like sometimes I can. If I'm in a bad mood, I'll convince myself that it's absurd how much I'm paying them. But what I have to come back to is, none of this would have been possible without them. You're paying more than just sort of the marginal support that they're giving you from corporate. You're paying for, a lot for all of the risk reduction that they've given you by tweaking the concept, finding something that really works, and constantly, trying to make the concept better and share that across the system. So, it's clearly there's a trade-off.
I would just point out that in a system like Applebee's, you can view the royalty as payment for ownership of the brand, which is already proven. Therefore, you're buying into sort of an asset they own. I don't look at it that way. And I believe that they do for me what I would otherwise have to do at a much lower cost than if I did it by myself. So, it's not paying for a past asset. It is every day getting what I need cheaper than I could do it myself. Like market
advertising,
developing creative product development. The Applebee's menu is 70% new in the last 2 years. They have a huge department that does that. I don't want to deal with that. It costs so much money to do.
That's sort of the definition of, is it a good franchise? If you're happy that they are doing that more effectively than you can, it's good. We'll see in a couple of years how you're still feeling and if you're still worried.
And so in the Burger King system, the franchisees are constantly moaning about how they're pissing away their money.
Yeah.
Right? They don't feel it's well spent at all and that they could do it for themselves better. They're wrong, by the way, but that's what they say.
I'll tell you that on our website, actually, I don't know if Anita's in here, but if there isn't now, there will be in a couple days, a link to some different resources on franchises. One of the things I found when I was kind of fishing around, Entrepreneur magazine on their website has some really good guidelines on things you should do when looking at a franchise, including questions that you ask a franchisee. So I suggest you take a look there. Before I open it to questions, one other thing I just thought of too. Last spring we did a program, I know some of you were there, more from the franchisor perspective. We had Hilton and a franchise attorney there, and it's actually available for viewing. For those of you who aren't GSB alumni, unfortunately you can't see it, but Erica Richter from Lifelong Learning has it set up, and you can actually view it online, again, linked from our website, so it gives you a slightly different twist of it. But before we open it to questions, which we'll do in a few minutes, anything else in particular that you guys want to add?
The one thing I'll say in closing before we open up the Q&A is that if I had known then what I know now, I probably, if I could have cobbled together the resources, I would have done this a long time ago. It's amazing, like people in my class and all the way down through even like current class, the current GSPers. I mean, it's amazing how many people have literally come out of the closet and say, I'm really interested in doing something like this. But whether it's a stigma that's prevented them from doing it, or whether they just didn't think they could do it, or whether people with this kind of background actually go out and absorb the opportunity cost for doing it. But I think the great thing is if people now see that people with our kind of background go out and do this, and the whole package as far as how liberating it is, how exhilarating it is. The economics are fabulous. I mean, if you pick the right concept, you execute well, you pick the right location. That alone, I think, is something that people just tend to underappreciate, and how well these things can do. If money means anything to you. So I definitely think that if it's something that you even have, unless you're absolutely committed to an idea or go into a particular industry, and you've had your heart set on that for your whole life, I would say definitely, open yourself up to doing something like this, because I think it combines a lot of the elements that attract us to the GSP to begin with.